All right.
So
Sound,
yeah,
sounds good.
like, so can you let, m- could you probably, I'm trying to figure out where to start because I'm like, oh, we can start from the very, very beginning.
Well,
Let's
let's
do that.
start
What do
from
you think we should?
John Arnold. John Arnold was a gentleman that in the 50s came to Stanford with the idea that we need to move this idea of production assembly to this idea that design is innovation. And it was really, I would say, the precursor to modern day design thinking in the sense that it was a process. And most people don't realize design thinking emerged from engineering. It's an engineering concept. So it's actual practical applications that people use it in now are typically in business, or even designers think of using it as their thing. But the reality is it came from an engineering mindset. And that sort of spark was a design group within an engineering department. And when I went to school, so that's the 50s, and I went to school in the 90s at Stanford, it was the fifth floor of a building. And it still also had its like side room type of thing. It never fully matured into what it could be. And it was always this sort of fifth floor to the side type of thing. Now, I'm assuming at some point someone's like, oh, the fifth floor is cool because you can look out. But it never had this like prestige or this place where like it was well respected across the university. And that mindset, I think a lot of the facilitation of these like ideas and concepts like were just honed and worked on in an education setting. But there was, when I went there to Stanford, one of the things I remember reading was product designers had the most millionaires on campus, right? As far as people had, and nobody really knew about product design. And the graduation rate, I think it was about 50 to 60 a year. So it was still very an underdeveloped even until the 90s. So what people know about design thinking is the sort of empathy maps and the process pieces there, but it really started from this small nucleus within the context of Stanford's engineering department. Again, if we were to take any idea, there's probably other facets of other organization. And so those all probably contribute. It's really hard to sort of put one thing on one place, but a lot of those sparks, I do believe, came from the Stanford program.
Well, in the book, How Innovation Works, there's this concept of idea having sex. Now, hear me out. It's the idea that innovation is,
We didn't pitch that in school.
yeah, it's the, well, it's the thesis, the eureka moment. You could do some forensic work, like idea work, and you could see, okay, well, this person got this idea from this guy, and this person got this idea from this woman, and then this woman went to a conference, got this idea, and it was this culmination of a bunch of ideas being built on top of each other. And that's actually like how innovation works, is that it's the creative selection of good ideas from a group of people or a community or a nation. And I don't doubt that there was way more nuance involved with design, but I do have a similar perspective as you, because all the thought leaders on the origins of like product design in the technology space were these engineers from like Sun Microsystem and Apple. Like, I think, if I understand correctly, is either Don Norman or someone else in the UX OGs, as some people call them, that were like solution architects or something at Apple or something like that. So can you talk a little bit of like the origins of like early UX thought leadership? And I'm going to use the term UX because that's where it ended up in the early 2000s, in the turn of the millennia.
Yeah.
But that's not the word that was used back then. But a lot of the principles were taught back then. Can you give me a little more?
There's two factions that sort of emerged from this conversation. If you look in the 90s and the post you had picked up on, I was speaking to Ralph Fasti. There was two advisors in the Stanford program, Ralph Fasti and David Kelly. David Kelly is the founder of IDEO and maybe the godfather of what you call design thinking. That movement started a physical product realm. And those practitioners like Don Norman you're speaking to are coming from a software background. Now, the interesting component of this is Stanford always had this sort of connection to industry where a lot of lecturers came into the program. Robert McKim is another person in this conversation. He's a visual thinker. He came from industry and was a lecturer and then became a professor. But I was at Stanford. I taught for about 9 years as well. This sort of overlap, and that product group, visual thinking and applications of need finding and trying to figure out how to put that into a business process. David Kelly was able to do that at scale using engineering and physical products. Design thinking emerged because you're trying to mitigate the risk of long development cycles of product of a year or so. And in the 90s, all that manufacturing started to merge with China. And so when you have these cycles and you're trying to find where's the value in this chain of creating things, design thinking started to be pushed, right? And I don't know how many people have seen the 2020 shopping cart. I was at Skyline Toys, which was acquired by IDEO, and I worked at IDEO for just a tad. That sort of large sort of expansion of design thinking emerged, I think, from that video where Nightline, I think it was 2020, where they exposed sort of the thinking process of designers and how that worked, and that kind of took off. So that's one faction of this, and that's the area that I probably know most about product design and design thinking emerging from that realm. And then there's this sort of usability, software, system architecture emerging in this sort of how do we make this more sane? And obviously you have the agile movement that sort of emerged out of the 90s and whatnot. But so maybe I'll just stop there as a starting place to look at that faction.
Well, yeah, like the way I see it is that design thinking preceded any mention of the term user experience. And I think I personally don't like the title UX designer because user experience is more of a competency in my perspective rather than an actual discipline. It's also limiting too because it's implying that the activities in typical UX design jobs are always going to lead to the best solution when you have a broader just design competency perspective. Of course you're going to, it's like, actually I was listening to this CTO at Carta. He was on one of the recent episodes of Lenny's podcast. I forgot his name, but he was talking about company value. And he said, user first or empathy is like one of our values. And he's like, okay, so other companies aren't empathetic or like there's no, so like what you're saying that people that don't say that are empathetic, that company values that are kind of just implicit, like ethical, like ground rules of like human society, of like a good human society. So saying, oh, user experience is important. I think this is biting that camp in the butt right now because yeah, of course, like engineers care about experience and product managers care about experience too. And so like when you make that your job title, it kind of comes back and bites you. But if you just actually leaned into the product design actual discipline, not just because product design is a discipline, meaning that you could have juniors and then like associates and do apprenticeships and build mentorships and like grow someone's talent over time. Like you could start them from an actual starting point, but it's rare to just take like something that requires like a competency. How do you become competent? You make mistakes, you develop intuition over time.